Bonjour, mesdames, messieurs. Je vais parler en anglais pour que vous pouvez me comprendre, but also because, as George Bush said, French is a language which doesn't even have a word for entrepreneur. So how can you talk about innovation in French? What I want to talk about is some questions around collective intelligence and connexity in a connected world. And I should say, I've really appreciated all the talks here at LIFT. I really wanted to come to listen, to know what to copy, borrow, adapt, but I was told I had to say something. And so I'm going to offer a few thoughts about these questions, which have been concerning me for many years. And about 15, 20 years ago, I did a PhD on telecoms at MIT. And as part of that, I had to read the literature of what people had said about networks back in the 1890s, the 1950s, the 1960s, and then again in the 1980s and 90s. And what was really striking if you read the history is how again and again you have some people saying the network will bring Big Brother, fascistic workplaces where your every movement is measured and monitored and you're punished if you spend more than 3 minutes going to the toilet, and other people saying they will liberate us, everything will be flat structures, project-based working, the end of hierarchies. And what happened? Well, they were both right. And that's happened again and again, including the great wave of hope of the late 90s around the internet, which happened to coincide with a period of major consolidation of corporate power and indeed government power happening alongside proliferation of liberating technologies. So as a result, I don't anymore ever believe anyone who only tells one side of the story. Everything is about shades. And that applies, I think, every bit as much to how we think about openness and open things. So here's a list. We're all here involved in, we love open innovation, open source, open networks, open platforms. And they are truly wonderful, liberating, and novel. But then we probably don't like the doors at our house to be left open. Some people are ambivalent about open relationships. Most of the citizens don't like open borders. Most companies don't like open IP. We were hearing about tax in the earlier session. Sweden does actually publish all your income tax returns, but certainly in the UK, and I think in France or the US, this would be seen as an outrageous invasion of privacy. So in everything we're talking about the balance of openness and closure. And one little sort of symbol of that is a wonderful experiment which happened in London when in Trafalgar Square, one of the plinths was opened up in an open source arts experiment. So thousands of people could each have 1 hour performing on this plinth whatever they wanted. Anthony Gormley, the sculptor, organized it. And in some ways, it was a marvelous demonstration of a different ethos of culture, making it available to everyone. The slight problem was nearly all of them were pretty rubbish. And probably, in retrospect, most people would have rather Anthony Gormley had put a really good sculpture up there, and that's roughly what's happened. So we're learning how to navigate the balance of openness and closure. And what I want to give a few examples of, which come out of our work, is ways of doing that. The organization I worked at until a month ago was the Young Foundation, which over 50 years created several hundred new organizations and innovations. Probably the most famous has the word open in it, which is the Open University, now with hundreds of thousands of students around the world, but also open colleges, open schools, open patient models, and so on. I've now switched to working for a funding body, which means I don't have to spend all my time looking for money, but it does mean I'm looking out for what are the things we should be financing in innovation, collaborative consumption, and so on. And where I think we're going, and this was very much talked about yesterday, are perhaps 3 different strategies which we all have to have in mind. One is how, as Adam Greenfield was saying yesterday, do we stop the abuses? Do we stop the worst uses of network technology to actually worsen our lives? How do we infect and almost embrace the hierarchies of government and business, which are not about to go away? And thirdly, how do we also grow the new outside them, the radically new models? And what I want to mainly talk about, in fact, is the middle one of those. And I think that's also going to be the most relevant for how we think about the workplace and learning. So here are just a few examples. This is a project we've been doing at Nesta, which is a very simple one, which says let's take an area, a neighborhood, and with a combination of public data and citizen data, map exactly who owns each little bit of land. So here's a sort of typical map where the council puts on the ownership structure and then citizens can add to it so it becomes more and more detailed. The aim being that then you can have a dialogue with citizens about, for example, a piece of land which could become a playground, or how to design a new cycle route through both public and private land. Very, very simple, but a hybrid of outside and inside approaches. Here's another one, very similar, Sutton Bookshare. Instead of having all the books in a library, you put all the books in people's homes into a virtual library, and you offer your books for sharing with your neighbors and citizens. Very, very simple idea. Easiest to get it to happen, though, with the backing of the municipality, but it then becomes very much a crowdsourcing model. And given that many people do have thousands, even tens of thousands of books in their house, even probably many of you, why not make them available to everyone else to share? Here's another simple one from Birmingham, which is civic dashboards. So you actually put on not only neighborhood data and so on, but also data on service use, pressure on call centers, etc. And I think we're already seeing a pretty dramatic changes in public organization as different kinds of data become available. And one of perhaps the challenges for data journalism is more a local data journalist as well as ones looking at Afghanistan and global phenomena. We have now in London the London Data Store, which is supporting this, which has worked pretty well of putting as much as possible of public data in raw form in a single store with very simple, clear protocols. The very first sort of pilot of this was helped by Tim Berners-Lee, which enabled you to simply cross-correlate data on bicycle accidents with Google Maps so that you could choose your route to work to avoid the places you were most likely to be killed on your bike. Very, very simple, but it sort of captured people's imagination how public data could be used. Now, many of these are about making data flow more. I want to now give an example which is almost the opposite, and I think more radical than any of those, which is still in pilot form in 3 places in the UK, and this is called MyDex. And the idea of this is to turn on its head the whole world of CRM, the world of big corporations, big government departments keeping their own databases on all of you with your age, demographics, consumption patterns, and so on. And MyDex says, let's turn that on its head, let's you, the citizen, own and control the data and lend it out to corporates or big public agencies, just what they need to know. Not a huge amount of information they don't need to know. It's called VRM, Vendor Relation Management software. And what's made this possible to happen is doing focus groups with members of the public, showing them what actually is happening to their data now, how it is being abused, messed up, lost. In the case of the British government, leaving CDs with millions of personal data records in car parks to be stolen. And this is a way of turning the tables. And enough corporates are realizing that they risk being on the wrong side of this, being in a position like a BP with its oil spills, once things go wrong with data and the public reaches a turning point, a tipping point, when they demand control. I think we need lots of MyDex-type experiments across the world to reinforce not only the technologies, but also the principle that you, the citizen, should control your data, its integrity, its quality, and you should determine which bits of it get shared around and when. Another example of, which is now coming to fruition, is a project which actually I was involved in the mid-90s, when we first developed and published a whole model of collaborative consumption supporting networks called Guaranteed Electronic Markets, to do very much what Buzzcar now does, so that you could lend out your car, your lawnmower, or indeed some of your time to your neighbors for ecological reasons. The actual implementation focused on time, making it easy for people to either give or sell short slivers of time into markets, into corporates, and so on. What in fact impeded this were rules in the welfare system, which have only just been removed in the UK, which as of this year, it will become much easier for people on benefits to sell 2 hours here, 3 hours there, 4 hours there, without being penalised in terms of their entitlements. One of the things which most intrigues me about where we go in the in the next 10 years is in a way how we use technologies to deepen relationships and not just to broaden them. And I think the correct critique of Facebook and so on is you have many acquaintances, but perhaps not deep friendships. And this is just one example I've been involved in, which I think shows a different kind of quality of organization of networks, but again, managing closure as well as openness. And Ties comes from Canada, and again, a very simple idea of using Facebook-type technology to organize a circle of support around a vulnerable older person or a disabled person so they can coordinate who's going to visit them, make a meal, remind them to take their prescriptions. Again, interestingly, this only works if you can integrate the informal social support of friends and family and neighbors with the formal support of the doctors and social workers and so on. I think this is an idea, and there are a number like it, with powerful potential, say, to deepen intimate circles of support rather than very thinly spread networks of relationships you can't really count on for doing anything really important in your life. Now, we heard about God in the very first session this morning, so this is a project which is about God. This came about from conversations about 5 years ago with lots of teenage Muslims in Britain. And we asked them what was the thing they most wanted from a new service. And they said the thing missing in their life, and this is probably not sort of part of your world, they wanted advice on the dilemmas of daily life, about food and sex and work, which was Quranically appropriate, which made sense in theological terms, but also made sense in terms of daily life in modern Europe. And out of this came the idea of Maslaha, which is at its core a semi-crowdsourced website, but has a pool of imams as advisors, as well as experts in health and education, and a whole series of questions like, is speed dating compatible with Islam? Not sure if any of you know the answer to that question, but if you look at Maslaha, you will find the relevant parts of the Quran. Or what should you be doing in Ramadan if you're a diabetic? And we've been trying to adapt this now, working with schools to develop curriculum materials for schools which have predominantly Muslim pupils, which again draws on the best of scientific knowledge, but also theology. And with a whole part of the site crowdsourcing from its users new ideas, new comments, new inputs. Again, very simple idea, but it's trying to, perhaps a bit like Saskia was saying, humanize technology, link it into deeper human aspirations, which perhaps aren't always immediately visible to the engineers. And this is an example which I've been very personally involved in, which is perhaps a very strange project called Action for Happiness, which we launched in April. It's now got about 15,000 members. And I think, again, is in what may be this emerging paradigm of new structures of website which combine openness but with degrees of closure. What this is essentially about is providing people with tools to live happier lives. So it's about what you do in your own life, in your family, in your school, in your workplace. And the idea is to make available the best scientific knowledge about what we know will affect your life, but also link people together horizontally in local groups, discussion groups, sharing groups, and so on. And what's interesting is here is like anything involving science, we needed some parts of this site to be quite rigorously policed so that we knew that the advice being given actually stood up to scrutiny, was evidence-based, and other bits to be very open. We're launching a whole stream of this now on happiness at the workplace. and are working with employers to create teams within workplaces who can look at everything from pay to physical conditions and so on to try and improve happiness, with, as it were, a real-time constant feedback system through this site. So again, a kind of hybrid, elements of very open network, open source and so on, but also trying to tie in to the much more structured, rule-based logic of science. I want to just mention two sort of methods and tools, again, because these were mentioned in the last session. So one is social innovation camps, which we at the Young Foundation started hosting about 3 years ago, which are weekend camps which bring together large groups of web designers and volunteers, and by the Sunday evening have to have a live website meeting a social need. These have worked very well. They've been done in Central Asia and Australia and Canada as well, with the same group organizing them. What's interesting is some of these have been entirely new ones. So like Enabled by Design, which you see there, was a platform for people with disabilities to work together on design of prototype products. Some of the other ones which have come out need, as it were, hybrid connections to the hierarchies. So one which came out of a camp in Scotland was called My Police, trying to create a feedback system for the police of complaints and issues and problems and data. Now that is taking off, but only because it could persuade the police that it was better for them to be part of this than entirely against it. The most recent one 2 weeks ago is the winner of the camp was for a new service making use of unused food at the end of the day from cafes and restaurants. So spotting not quite an unused capacity, but an underused resource, as Robin was saying yesterday, and finding a new way to aggregate it and link it to need. So I'm convinced these kind of camps with very structured method and small amounts of money can achieve quick results far better than classic public purchasing or whatever. And the other example is a thing we did at the Young Foundation called I Do Ideas. We found that for teenagers with great ideas, the idea that to fill in a grant application form was completely anathema. So I Do Ideas is grant giving by video upload. And we're now, with help from one of the mobile phone companies, turning this into a global mobile app. It horrifies bureaucrats, the idea that you might give away money solely in response to a video rather than a form with lots of boxes to tick and so on. But if you're talking about relatively small sums of money and quite marginalized communities, this turns out to be a much more effective way of doing it. And rather to our surprise, a couple of bits of public bureaucracy are now willing to experiment with this and see if they lose their jobs or not. I think I'll jump over this one. I want to focus really in my last few minutes on what we're learning from all of this. This being France, a little bit of Hegelian philosophy is probably allowed. The crude Hegelian dialectic is that progress and logic moves from thesis through antithesis to synthesis. I think in some of what we're seeing is the kind of thesis of hierarchy and structure and pyramids, the antithesis of open networks, equality, flatness, and so on, leading in some cases to new syntheses, which are links between hierarchies and open networks, links between specialist expertise and very open expertise. You can see this in business, with firms like GSK developing innovation platforms, linking the internal structure with some open source use. Most of the business open or user-driven innovation is not really user-driven at all. It is the corporate hierarchy opening little bits out to users to input. And indeed, what we're seeing in business is an almost exact parallel to what happened in social movements. I love reading people like Eric von Hippel and Henry Chesbrough, who are their words are almost identical to many social movement writers of the 19th century. And business, in a way, has learned a whole set of ideas from the social sector, which itself went through these phases of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which were slightly different. And we're learning some of the barriers of that. This is a failure, a really interesting failure, when New Zealand tried to put a piece of legislation up as a wiki, so anyone could write the Police Act. Now, that turned out not to work very well, but it's kind of useful for us because it started establishing some boundaries. I think we're seeing interesting lessons in the US where peer-to-patent, which is open source, semi-open source comment on patent applications, does seem to be working well, whereas challenge.gov, which is trying to, again, a government website, open up for public ideas, doesn't seem to be working so well. It hasn't got the right granularity, the right structure of process to get ideas which can then feed through the government thinking. So for me, the really interesting question we're facing now is really how do we learn better as innovation accelerates? How do we not have just lots of projects, but fast synthesis and learning of the answers to these sort of questions? What really works in crowdsourcing? Many of the experiments haven't worked. What really works in design? Some of the application of design tools to the social field, public sector have worked disastrously, others have worked really well. What works in incubation? What works in co-creation? All of you will be part of the answers to these questions. One of the things we've done at the Young Foundation, and I'm sort of taking over to Nesta to support, is some new structures for helping us learn more honestly about what works, about failures as well as successes. So if you don't know it, the Social Innovation Exchange is one site which does that with about 3,000 members and organizations worldwide. We have now in Europe, Social Innovation Europe, which is being run by 6 to help Europe learn quicker from its own experiences and become more serious, more systematic at understanding what innovations work and what don't. And one of the things which I'm involved in trying to do through both of those is what we're calling a Global Innovation Academy, to turn the insights about what does or doesn't work into digestible lessons and tools for people working in NGOs, social entrepreneurs, businesses, governments, and so on around the world. And we're doing pilots in all of these places to test out the model. So if any of you are interested, let me know. I just want to finally just make one or two comments about what lies behind this. One of the reasons for doing this work on the Academy is to try and make innovation simple, comprehensible, digestible, to make it not just a thing which very clever people paid large sums of money do. And one of the things we've been struck again and again is if you look at real innovations in the social field in particular, they're very rarely breakthrough. They're very rarely genuinely out of the box. They look out of the box from a distance, but if you look in more detail, they're nearly always a combination of quite describable methods of inversion, where you turn things on their head, like you make the peasant the banker, the patient the doctor, integration, extension, differentiation, addition, and so on. I won't go through all of these. The point is, using these methods, almost any group, from ordinary citizens to nurses or teachers or pupils, can innovate and can find it demystified, can quite quickly go to very radical ideas, but in fact it's through steps which are not so radical, which are more incremental and more graspable. And I think we have to avoid some of the mystique which surrounds innovation, particularly in relation to technology, and make it clear that in fact maybe it isn't so difficult. It isn't quite such a rocket science after all. And the final point is really one about how we think about openness itself. Again, we had a presentation earlier this morning about Cogno, developments in brain science. To me, one of the most interesting things emerging from our knowledge of how the brain works is, yes, it has billions of connections between your brain cells and synapses and so on. But more and more, it's becoming clear that one of the ways the brain works is to stop the flow of information. Is why we have a left brain and a right brain, in part to stop them communicating too much with each other. If you have, as I say there, too much peripheral vision, you can't actually see anything. If you have too many thoughts rushing through your brain, you can't actually think. And one of the lessons we're learning, I think, in all of these fields is how do we get the right balance of flow and openness and multiplication with the right kinds of closure, the right kinds of protection, the right kinds of privacy, the right kinds of silence. And silence is often, in fact, where we do most of our thinking So we need technologies which help silence, not clutter and noise, as well as ones which help the flow of data. So these are just a few random thoughts from me. I think we need fast and slow. We need always on, but also often off. We need open as well as closed. And we need new hybrids of inside and outside, of very specialist, deep knowledge of fields, and the wisdom, and sometimes the stupidity of crowds as well. I don't have most of the answers, or really any of the answers to these things, and I think we're in a period now of dramatic experimentation in collective intelligence, where many things won't work, and what's most important is we're honest about those things. We have a learning culture around all of these things we do, which admits failure and moves quickly on, because we have, I think, an extraordinary privilege. We are the first ever generation to be able to experiment, to reflect on the way in which the world thinks, creates, and makes in a way that no generation has been able to do ever before. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. We have just time for a few questions.
Yeah.
So could you just summarize how you think that education should change to really prepare the people for the world you're pointing at?
Well, one of the things which I've been doing at the Young Foundation is creating a new kind of school. Mm-hmm. And we've launched this school about a year ago, and it was really designed as a school which teenagers would fight to get into, not fight to get out of. And it was to appeal to the teenagers who most hated school. And we found, and we did various trials, and we found the best way to appeal to them was to really turn the idea of schooling on its head. So instead of most of the school being people sitting in rows with a teacher teaching at them, we made 80% of the curriculum practical projects, real-life projects working with a business or a charity on a problem solving. And through those, you learn the science, the maths, and so on. The field trials for these got amazing results from the school kids. We opened 2 last year, 10 this year, 40 next year, all across England. And we call them studios because the studio is the old Renaissance idea of work and learning being integrated. Now, they have a lot of technology in them. Everything will be done, every pupil will have a mobile, etc. But in fact, technology hasn't been the starting point. The starting point is a spirit of education, and then on the back of that, you build your networks and technologies to fit. Whereas what went wrong so often in the 90s and the last decade was technology-driven solutions implanted into the classroom, dumped on teachers who didn't like them, and they didn't work at all. Yeah. We have to get the question right first and then build the technology around that rather than start with our kit.
Very interesting. What is the name of that project, the school?
Studio Schools.
Studio Schools, okay. And then we have one very concrete question. One of the lifters asked what you think about the Reclaim the Fields initiative in the UK?
There's been a whole series of initiatives around land and buildings. And indeed, I've been very involved in some of the ones around urban agriculture. And one of the good effects of the financial crisis and the recession was, well, not a good effect, but we had lots of buildings stopped, empty plots of land. We had lots of high street buildings left empty. And so people moved very fast to create websites which could spot these places, link them to potential uses, become brokers, and so on. At the Young Foundation, we advocated too for legal rights for people to claim unused land and buildings. We didn't quite get those, but we got sort of halfway to a right. So there's a lot going on taking over plots of land for temporary urban agriculture, or buildings for temporary colleges. We're running a thing called the Citizens University, which is taking over empty high street premises for ultra-short courses in first aid and so on. And I think this whole use of the web as a tool for recapturing land and making land a common resource, and especially wasted land, is really exciting. Of course, to become really radical, it would have to take over the wasted land of very wealthy people who have 10 homes. They only use one of them at any one time. Or the golf courses, which squander so much of the land of our countries. But that's maybe a little bit too radical an idea for today.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Geoff. It was very inspiring.
Thank you.